Hi there, YouTubers. We're rolling. And this is the first cut of the Woodstock story. And this is going to be a pretty long one, so that's why it's going to be in many parts. Because it takes so long for me to upload this onto the YouTube, and I try to keep it under 15 minutes. So, here we go. It's now 27 seconds. And so I kind of grew up in the shadow of New York City, out in Long Island. And not only that, my parents, when I got to be about 13, they moved back into New York City and had an apartment on Park Avenue and also another one on 69th between 3rd and Lex. And Lexington and Madison Avenue were like almost medieval. There were a lot of, not all the buildings were like, super tall. Most of them were under, 6, 7 stories. At least this is in the early 60s. And I'm sure it's all been torn down and turned into Trump Towers. Anyway, so, but they had all of these great shops and restaurants and places, coffee shops and just kind of hangout kind of places. And they were like cultural. I mean, they were like little communities unto themselves. And there was Hunter College right across from our apartment building. And then on Park Avenue, there was the Council on Foreign Relations. And then further down, there was Central Park. And then up about, 10 blocks was the Museum of Art. And if you went north, it was that, the Met. And then if you went south, you hit MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and there was the Guggenheim, and there was also another art museum that had white columns downtown that I helped start. But these were all amazing places that I could just walk. St. Patrick's, these are all things I could just go and as like a 10-year-old, just walk around and be no problem. And my parents never thought twice about letting me to roam the streets there. And that was one of the great things of my parents, was they were so busy doing their thing that they never thought twice about what I was doing. I never got in trouble, and I never gave them cause to worry. I mean, yes, I was a bit strange, because of my interest in science and technology and art and culture and esoteria at a young age. But, they didn't really think that was bad or strange or different or because they didn't quite understand it. So I had a tremendous amount of freedom. And that is one of the keys of being a good parent. Letting your, all you got to do is keep your kids away from the chainsaws, right? And be a good example. Even though my parents were like, stressed beyond belief and could, blow up at any minute, they were actually pretty good parents, especially after years later when I started working in social services, I saw what really bad parents were. And so when people complain, oh, my parents are so evil, so terrible, no, forget about it. You haven't a clue. That is bourgeois narcissism. When you think the world revolves around you and everyone's picking on you, not really. No one cares, And that was one of the beauties of New York City in the 60s, is that you could go anywhere and be anything, and no one cared, and you could get involved in all kinds of things and then go a couple blocks that way and you were somebody else. So, my interest in electricity confounded my parents, and my mother brought me into the electric world when she just couldn't take me fooling around with her appliances, and I went to work for an electrical contractor. Not work, but, he was my mentor, I was like the wizard's apprentice, right? And this guy had wired everything. He had wired the Empire State Building. He had been Tesla's #1 guy. He was the first guy to have a master electrician's license in New York City. He started Local 3 in the IBEW. I mean, this guy was it, Grandpa Stahl. And his son, who was running the business, Mike Jr., had 5 daughters, and he treated me like his son. And so, as I said before, by the time I was 13, I was a pretty good electrician. I knew what I was doing. And I could fix things. You know, I had a kind of innate characteristic of being able to fix things. And so they would send me off to do that. And I had my little bag of tools, and I would go do that. And we mostly, the fixing kind of stuff was mostly for landlords. And after a while, these landlords say, "Hey, Al, I got this great apartment for you. You can just, just fix some things, sweep the hallways." And, so at 14, I had my own apartment. My dad kept saying, "You don't like it, you can leave." Well, I went and got myself my own apartment. I would come home every Friday because my grandma would be cooking dinner, and I loved her cooking. And, I'd wash clothes and do that, and no one seemed to notice I wasn't there. Because most of the year, I was away at boarding school. So, they got used to me not being there. And I was there enough to be, oh, there he is. But I had this freedom. And that freedom, at the age of, how old was I? About 13, I left a note on my parents, on my pillow saying, "I'm not running away, I'm taking a vacation." And I left and I hitchhiked up to Maine, where I had gone to camp the summer before and met this young girl named Teresa. And we were like Romeo and Juliet without the conflict. And we were so sweet. We weren't even knew what sex was, but we cherished and loved each other's company. And her parents were so cool. When I showed up, and I showed up like 3 a.m. in their little town of Bridgeton, and he was he owned the gas station, the general store. He was the postmaster, and I didn't want to wake him up, so I slept. I curled myself up like a dog on the mat on their front door, and this girl's dad came out and found me on their porch and said, "Al, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I've come to stay with you." He goes, "Oh, okay, yeah, I could use some help." And so he called up my dad and said, "Hey, your son's here, don't worry, we're going to take care of him." And I spent the summer there. My 13th year. But, that's the kind of freedom I had. My parents didn't even freak out. Okay, he's up in Maine, and he's safe, and he's good, and they went on about whatever they were doing. And that was my life. I always had secondary parental people who watched out for me, took care of me, guided me, inspired me, and showed me the way by their example. And that is one of the things that is missing. And by that example, it gave me the freedom, the courage, the self-confidence to go try anything, So, when I was about 14, 15, 16, even though I was going, during the winter months, fall, winter, early spring, I'd be at prep school, I would come back and pretty much have my own life in New York City. And I got this apartment on Avenue B and 9th Street, and my next door neighbor was Allen Ginsberg, and I had a great apartment that had a backyard and a garden because it had been a nunnery, and we used to have these salons there that were just kicking. The whole avant-garde of New York and Europe would travel through our apartment, and I was like 16. And on my usual route from work to home, I would walk down 6th Street, and the stage door to the Fillmore East, which was the rock and roll Valhalla of Billy Graham, not the Christian dude, but a nice Jewish boy who was a promoter, and he had the Fillmore East and the Fillmore West, and there were bands, and that was in the Haight in San Francisco, and groups like Velvet Underground, the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, the Who. These were all groups that, when they were starting, would play in his hall, and he had a 16-track recording studio. Studer board and or Studer recorders and Neve board, one or the other. Those were the two state of the art, and he would record these shows, and he would give the bands the door, which would be $2,000-$3,000 for the night, and he would keep the tapes. That was part of the contract. And then years later, when they became super uber famous, or all these, Janis Joplin live at the Fillmore, Grateful Dead live at the Fillmore, he made millions. And then he would promote these big shows. So he was one of the bankers of Woodstock. And he had all these bands that played at the Fillmore lined up to play at the Woodstock, right? So every day I'd walk by the Fillmore, and one day the house stage doors were open, and a gigantic explosion occurred, and all this wire came flying out the side of the stage door. And these morons, the Grateful Dead was going to play, and they had this thing called the Wall of Sound, these hundreds of speakers, and they plugged it into an outlet that blew up the speakers, right? And he's screaming, and I'm walking by with my little bag of tools, my little belt of tools. He looks down at me, "Hey, kid, you're an electrician." I go, "Yes, sir. Come up here." So that became my career, my other career, and I became a theater electrician. And Grandpa Stahl had wired everything, you name it. He knew it. He knew Joe Melziner. He actually got me hooked up with Lester Polikoff, who is one of the greatest Broadway theater designers. He was Joe Melziner's best boy, so I became Lester's best boy. And so I had all of these doorways into different aspects of art and culture, and I just kind of seamlessly walked from one to the other. And it didn't seem, surprising to anyone or anything, because lots of other people were doing the same thing. And it was just one of these amazing times when you could almost do if you had the courage of your convictions, confidence, and talent and some smarts, you could almost do anything without having to be born into a family. It wasn't class oriented. You didn't have to go to the right school. And I was going to the right schools. So I had this pretty amazing life. And so I was working at the Fillmore East every time I would come back from school. And my boss was a guy named Bob Goddard, who owned Pig Lights and Joshua Light Show, which was the quintessential 1960s light show. He had the overhead projectors and two pieces of glass and the oily colors, and that was like, whenever you see the psychedelic lighting, that's kind of what it was. He was one of the first people to use video projectors, and pretty much what you see of the big shows of today came out of Bob Goddard's head. And so, bottom line, I was his master electrician. I mean, he had, grips and techs and stuff like that, but, that was an old house. It was wired like in the 1920s, and it was totally underpowered for the kind of lighting they did, so I put in a new service, put in sub panels, put in really good grounding, because that place had a wicked buzz, so, the amplification wouldn't have So, and I got to know all about that technology. And so I wired a number of recording studios and nightclubs, and that's kind of how I went into that scene in the 70s, was from there to there. But Bob got every gig there was, because he was the man. So when, and I didn't run shows. I did, but that wasn't my gig was to make sure nothing blew up and the electricity flowed fine and everything worked. And so that was a vaudeville house. So the dressing rooms were on the side of the proscenium. You went up these spiral staircases. And if you ever watched 1930s movies of the theater, you're always seeing the dancers running up and down these spiral staircases because the dressing rooms were on the side because they had no room, so they put them up the side. And I remember there was one dressing room that had just had one little plug fuse down in the basement. You had to go down miles to go get it. And I remember one of the bands that was, so full of themselves was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And they blew out the fuse about 5 times because they had hair dryers. And they were like blow drying their hair. And after the 3rd time they blew out the fuse, I said, that's it for you guys. You're not, you're going to, here's a flashlight. And they said, you know who we are? We're Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And I said, I couldn't care less. I'm the electrician. No electricity for you. It was like the soup Nazi. That's me. I was the electrician Nazi. And I was only 17, and they were like really, So, and that was my attitude, because I was a Local 3 guy, and boy, that was Local 3's attitude. So that was kind of interesting. So Woodstock, they're planning for Woodstock, and Bob's, marshaling the materials, and he gets a couple of trucks, and we're bringing stuff from New York out into up to Woodstock, New York, and we built a beautiful site. I mean, really, and we spent months doing it, and we had everything perfect, just wired in, just zoned in perfect, and little did we know there was a legal hassle about this, and the county that we were setting this site up in had a lease for the property, and so they said, nope, sorry, can't do it. Like, with 3 weeks ago, we had to move everything from there over to Yasgur's farm, and Yasgur hated the county because they screwed with him with what he wanted to do, and he said, screw it. You guys can do it here. I won't charge you anything. I hate these people, and I'll just thumb my nose, and there's not much they can do. It's private property, right? I'm just having a party. So we had to move everything like 6 miles over to this guy's farm and set it up, and it started raining and raining and raining and raining. And, we had to lay cables and had, big generators, and we had a lot of juice. I mean, a lot of juice. We had, a small city's worth of electricity. And we had these big diesel generators and big heavy welding cables, and we couldn't really prepare it the way we had the other site, because we had months to do that, and this we were throwing everything together in weeks. They had these big towers that we put, that were like, the kind of scaffolding. It was just scaffolding, right? But they went up hundreds of feet because we had super troopers, these big super duper follow spots, arc welding follow spots, right? And so anyway, we set all this stuff up. We get it all ready. It's like a real horse race if we're going to get it ready. And we needed some more equipment. And so my boss, because I wasn't, I didn't do drugs, I didn't drink. I was, the one guy who never got stoned, because I don't like that stuff. It just doesn't make me feel right. It's like, So, my boss says, okay, you got a driver's license, you won't get stopped because you're you're the one person I trust the most. You're my electrician. So, I went to take the big truck and go back to the shop in New York, and we need this, 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 and this. Gave me a big list. So I drove down. I stopped. It was like late at night, so I slept. I woke up. I started to fill the truck. I turned on the radio, and they had closed down the New York State Thruway. There was no way I was getting up there, period. So I said, well, I don't need to, load the truck. I kind of backed it into the lot, locked it up, went back to my place and went to sleep, right? And Woodstock went on without me. And about 2 weeks after everything was said and done, that's when the roads kind of cleared, and I went up with the truck to get the stuff. And all my fellow technicians, they were all pissed at me because they did not have a good time. They got dysentery in the trots. They got electrocuted. They took the brown acid. Nobody who worked that show really had a good time, right? And so I was up there, and that's when I ran into Steve Yaggers of the farm from Tennessee. And the reason why no one died, and because they were only expecting 20,000 people and 500,000 showed up. So they had no water, no food, no anything to help feed, heal, take care of 500,000 people. So Steve and the farm took care of everybody. And so I was there. The rest of the crew filled up one of the trucks and went back because they were sick as a dog and really just, ugh. So me and a few other guys who were not even part of Bob's crew, but were guys from the farm that Bob kind of hired, we took everything down, apart, put it in the other two trucks, and packed it up to go. But that took a few days, and I had to clean up a bunch of electric stuff and set some other things up so the people who were staying there finishing up cleaning up the place would have electricity. So I was up there about 4 or 5 days, and I hung out with these guys from the farm, I knew Chipmunk, I knew Wavy Gravy, but I didn't know them because they were California guys. But they would come to the Fillmore because they were part of the Fillmore family, right? So anyway, so I got to know them pretty good, and when we went back to New York, they came back and stayed at my apartment for about a month. So I got to know those guys really well, and they knew Alan really well and other people. And that summer, in 69, 68, those 2 summers were amazing because all of the revolutions that were going on in Europe and, the Democratic Convention in Chicago and all of that, it was like we were somehow in a bubble away from that. And everyone shared everything. And yeah, everyone was stoned and on drugs and doing all kinds of crazy things, but it hadn't gotten really bad. It was like sweet and innocent and free love. And I was, 16, 17, and, I was just the innocent observer. I've always been somewhat naive, and I never worried about, what's going to happen? Oh, this is terrible. Oh, no, because I was always very good at noticing when something bad was going to happen, and I would just not be there. So those 2 summers were quite amazing. And then in 1970, that was about, I'm not quite sure whether it was 69 or 70, I think it was 70 or 71, the first Rainbow Gathering started. And basically it was trying to relive Woodstock. And now, as my fellow technicians told me, it sucked. It was terrible. You mother, you didn't have to suffer like we, it was terrible. they talked like it was war, living through World War II or something. And it was what it was. So Woodstock was this amazing thing, and I was very lucky to experience it on its better self. And it's just like Daffy Duck having the devil on one side and the angel on the other. And I've always been able to be my better angel, right? Things happen all the time, and instead of me freaking out about it or being upset about it, I try to make the best of it, the silver lining. And folks who have it amazingly good, they shouldn't be worrying about anything. That's all they do is worry. Oh, I'm going to lose this. Oh, it's terrible. I don't have the best sneakers. Oh, I have to spend $1,000 on that new T-shirt. No, you don't. You can go to Goodwill and buy just a nice T-shirt for 25 cents. And that has been my path, is not to worry about the material world, but to embrace the spiritual world. Because only through that can one, ascend spiritually. Because these little bags of water that are our bodies, they are just our avatar. Our soul is in some server someplace in Alpha Centauri. And we don't have a clue of what reality really is. What we are experiencing in the material world is a total illusion. And everyone who's so sucked up into their little screen or their little life, or they have to have this and they have to have that, and oh, I can't pay my bills, and da 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 da. No, it's how you can serve the ascension of love, because what is truly God is love. Love is God, and co-creation of love. Meaning everything that's manifested in the most loving way is co-creation, And that's what God or love wants from us, is to co-create with it. And not worry about our bills, and not worry about business, and not worry about any of that. And so that was what was beautiful about, 1960... 67, 68, 69, 70, 71. Those were really amazing, special years. And what's interesting is, over the years, I've become a scholar. And, I've always had scholars as my teachers, and I've been drawn through the scholarly way rather than the scholastic way. And one of the early things I learned was that the universe runs on cycles. Tesla was all about frequency, and you look at scalar power source or scalar energy, or it's, our electricity is run on Hertzian waves, the XY coordinate, right? 2 dimensions. Scalar is 16 dimensions. So it's a more, people like Rutherford and Faraday, they called it and Tesla and Steinmetz and Einstein, they all called it the ether. And we are coming around through string theory to realize they were right. It's not electrons and protons. No, that's kind of just the Newtonian way of looking at things, right? That's not really how it works. And what was amazing about those 4 or 5 years was that it hooked up with the frequency of the higher realms. And even if people didn't, some people say, well, everybody was doing acid. Of course, they were seeing higher realms. But I wasn't, and yet I was surrounded by it, and I was vibrating with it. So over those 5 years, between my parents living up on Park Avenue, and I'd go up there, and I had a bed up there, and I would stay there every so often and hang with my grandma and hang with my parents, but mostly I had my own place. And they liked it that way, because I wasn't, that teenager driving them insane. And I didn't ask them for money. I had my own income. And the thing about it was that from 69th Street down to the Lower East Side, down to Houston Street, was a frequency all its own. And it was like no other place. Other parts of New York City were interesting. Harlem was, and anyway, the West Side was, but this was really interesting, and especially Central Park South, and at the end of Lexington, there was a park and a hotel there, and from that point up to about 69th Street, on Lexington and Madison, there were all these little shops, curio shops, that had some pretty amazing people running them. And I spent, those 4 or 5 years, if I wasn't working or downtown, I was, cruising around that stuff, walking up towards my parents' place, and I had all these friends and that's how I got involved in the Theosophical Society, how I got involved in the esoteric and the occult and the the esoteric and occult that I was involved with was technology, was Scalar and Tesla and all these other 19th century scientists. Not so much Madame Blavatsky. I was part of the Theosophical Society, so yeah, I was schooled and all of that too, but I kept looking at as technology and not magic or the devil or any of that stuff, because I had some theologian teachers, priests, who basically said that good and evil was a human choice. And now there were bad things out there. There were things that went bump in the night. There was Lucifer. Yes, there was hell and heaven, but they existed on earth, not just, in some other plane. Now, there were other dimensions right next to where you were standing, and that's where ghosts and demons and all that kind of stuff came from. And so in those 4 or 5 years, I was exposed to all of that, but on a more scholarly sense rather than like a dogma. I was so undogmatic about anything, and I still am. I don't believe in dogmas, Now, I don't believe in anything. I have faith in love's totality. And that, no matter what happens, kind of protects me and protects us all. I mean, humanity has done so many stupid things, we should be toast by now. So, all of this, what was going on, it wasn't a linear experience. It was like a totality, like snap of the fingers. Everything in those 5 years was happening at the same time, all the time, and I had all of these scholarly people explaining and showing me, and lifting the veil of the mystery to me. And that's kind of how I got to be who and what I am, because, between that age of, because even when I was, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I had people watching out for me. I had folks who cared about me more than my parents did, but again, they were totally distracted, in trying to keep up with the Joneses and being rich and doing this and doing that, and dealing with my older brothers and sisters who were driving them nuts, because my parents would say, go do this, and I say, yes, right away, of course, I'll do it just like you say, and then I go off and do whatever the heck I wanted. And they never figured out that I didn't do what they said. I would do something so it looked like I did what they said, but, they didn't care, because I wasn't getting in their way. I wasn't, because, man, after my little experience with my mom, I'll kill you, I never, never crossed her. And my dad, too. I just never got in his way when he wasn't feeling right. When he was in his good shape, he was loads of fun. He was the man, over the horizon. Let's go have a good time. He was always doing something special. Like we always, every Friday, we would go to Chinese restaurants for dinner. There was this one restaurant my mother loved. At least twice a month we would go to that restaurant so she could have lamb with mint jelly. If she had that twice a month, she was good. And she had her cocktails, she was good. She had her cigarettes, she was good. And that's kind of how, and I was the observer watching all of this. And it all made sense, whether people were down on the Lower East Side, having a good time, or my parents, I could see that, being at ease, not diseased, was the way to go. And that's why my mom lived to be 103, Dad 98, and disease means the distraction or destruction of the ease. And if you can stay in that ease, you'll be okay. So that's what this little video is about, is staying in that ease. And that's what Woodstock, why 500,000 people showed up instead of just 20,000 and no one died, even though it was a hellhole and, 500,000 people shitting everywhere, not the best. They didn't have 500,000 porta-johns, It was pretty, and that's like my friends, my fellow workers were so pissed that I didn't have to suffer that, that, I got stuck in New York where I could sleep in my bed. They had to sleep, in the truck or in a mud puddle, and those guys were sick for weeks afterwards, And I did experience it, and I experienced it in the best of times, meaning when we set up, that was loads of fun. And a lot of those people, because it was Woodstock, they were hanging out there and playing music, and, a third of the people who played at Woodstock, and why the thing was in Woodstock to begin with, is they all lived up there. And there were recording studios up there, and I had been up there working on things like that, and wiring people's this and that. And so I knew that town, I knew the people, so I had a very nice time, And then when things got pretty icky, I was down in the Lower East Side, sleeping in my own bed, taking a shower and using a toilet and, going to the Ukrainian restaurant instead of eating nothing. So that's kind of what life's about. To be at ease, to be in the flow. Now the music, I worked at the Fillmore East for 3-4 years, so man, I heard all those bands 4 or 5 times, And I worked in recording studios, so I knew all those people quite intimately. I had some quite interesting experiences, like the story of Jimi Hendrix. I met him. Bob said, "Hey, go down to the loading dock and unload that truck." I said, "Well, that's not my job. I'm the electrician." He goes, "Well, no one's here to do it. You go down and do it." I said, "Okay." So I went down there and started unloading his truck, and this black guy leaning against the wall said to me, "You need a hand?" I said, "Gee, thanks. That's really nice of you. Yes, I'd love a hand. Sure, please, give me a hand." So this black guy and I unload the truck. Then we kind of, are sitting on the loading dock, and he brings out a joint, and it's right on 6th Street. We're smoking a doob, and he's got a beer, and it's really hot, and his beer is really cold, and I'm not really into either of those things, but in that moment with that guy, it was perfect. And we talked for about half an hour about this and that. We talked about the Vietnam War. He had been to Vietnam. We talked about how he learned how to play guitar. We talked about where he grew up and his mother and his grandma. And we talked about grandmas. And we had a really beautiful 40 minutes, right? And then I said, "Well, I got to go back upstairs and take care of something." He says, "Yeah, I got to get ready." So we leave our separate ways. A few hours later, when a show was running, I stayed over near stage right, where the power distribution was, just in case something went wrong. And, I had my nice little easy chair over there and a nice little light if I wanted to read something. and I had the little headset so I could hear the stage manager tell me this, that, or the other thing. And, if an amplifier went, wacky, I would go over and kick it and the hum would go out. And anyway, I was right on stage for all of that stuff. And, there's no better place to see The Who or the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane or anybody except 5 feet from them when they're playing it, right? And so anyway, on stage, and this black guy, walks out in some really amazing silk duds that are, akin to Sergeant Pepper's, and he's got 3 girls on each arm, and he walks out there with his guitar, and who was it but the black guy, Jimmy, who helped me unload the truck. And he kind of taps me and winks and goes on and does his act. And there was Jimi Hendrix. And, after the show, he said, hey, we're going to go out to get something to eat. You want to go? I said, nah, I'm going to go home and go to sleep. He goes, well, that's probably a better idea. And I saw him a couple more times, and then he was dead. I actually, I fixed his amplifier from his buzz, and he basically told the people who put together the recording studio that he wanted me to be their electrician. So, I got my boss to go get the job, and I started wiring it away, and he passed away before he had used it, but it wasn't up to snuff, and then he OD'd. But Electric Ladyland went on, even without Jimi Hendrix. And he did not seem to me to be a guy who, did more than smoke pot and drink beer, So I don't know how that guy really, because so many of those people just OD'd, and they didn't seem to me to be people, like Morrison. He didn't seem like a guy who would really, OD, So I don't know about that. Anyway, it was a magical period. And then 71, I finished high school in 68. I went off to college where I was studying theater, but I had already was working in theater. I was like working for Lester. I was at the Lincoln Center. I met Marion Tulin, who got me into Hofstra theater department, and I went from this New York City scene of where everyone just kind of, no matter how different they were, no matter how really different they were, everyone kind of fit. And when I went off to Hofstra, no, no one seemed to fit. Everybody seemed to be in some strange version of teenage angst, And so I had I just kept falling into really interesting situations there. Like my mother, it was a total Jewish school, Hofstra, Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers, and young Jewish girls who wanted to marry Jewish doctors and lawyers. And so there were hardly any Catholic people there, or anybody other than Jewish folk. And I had played lacrosse in prep school, and I was pretty good. And I didn't go there on a sports thing. Marion Tulin got me in, and my parents paid the bill. And but someone said, saw me with a lacrosse stick, and I could handle it pretty good. So I was playing that. So I kind of hung out with those guys and went to their parties. But when I showed up the first day, I was like Holden Caulfield and Catcher in a Rye. And I was in the all-boys dorm. And I went up to the top where they had this kind of rathskeller. But these Italian boys took it over. And these were all sons of mobsters who had sent their boys to become college-educated mobsters, lawyers, doctors, engineers of the mob. And this one guy was brilliant computer guy, and he was in the computer department, and he had taken over Hofstra University, and he was selling grades. You know, if you wanted to go to medical school or to law school, and you're only a C student, this guy would make sure you had straight A's for 4 years. And you just had to pay $1,000 a semester for an A, and so these guys had the place wired like unbelievably. And so they moved people around. They started their own department, Dr. Bellows Pneumatic Institute, and they got the school to buy them all the nitrous oxide they wanted. So that was my first day there. I'd never gone to an orgy, and there it was. So anyway. So that was my college first 2.5 semesters, and then I just because all of my professors were going, "Why are you here? I mean, you go to class, and then you go into New York, and you do a job that I wish I had, but I have to settle for teaching this stuff, and you're actually doing it. So why are you?" I was going there because that's what my parents expected, and also it kept me out of the Vietnam War. And my third semester, I had a beautiful girlfriend, and we were terribly in love. And she had this addiction to this older man who, since high school, knocked her up 3 times. And this was when abortion was illegal. And when I met her for, the first time, she was pregnant for her second time, and didn't know what to do, and she didn't, and the guy was cutting her loose, and I had friends in New York who were doctors and there was, New York State by that time was one state that was kind of legal for that procedure, but it was still, you had to know the right person. And so I did that, and then, I nursed her back to health, and in that thing we became sweet on each other. And then she was part of the theater department. She was beautiful and brilliant and knew 9 languages, and she was just unbelievable. And she had a girlfriend who was transsexual and, was a girl, but wanted to be a guy. And we were like the 3 Musketeers, and we would get dressed up because we had, a theater department with a makeup department and costumes, and we would get and just go into New York dressed as 19th century people, 7th century people, just we'd have a lot of fun. And I knew all these people in New York. I could go into any nightclub, I could go to almost any place. I was like in Goodfellas, the guy who tells the story, and he can go into any nightclub, and they put the table out front for him in front of Tony Bennett, and Tony goes, "Hey, how you doing?" Anyway, that was kind of me. And these girls, we just had the best of time for about, 6 months, until the older guy came back and swept her away and knocked her up again and threw her under the bus again. And again, I helped her, over it, nurse herself back, and her girlfriend wanted to go and kill the guy, and then what happened, before the next semester, she went away with a guy again, and that was it. Both her, the transsexual and me said, "Honey, forget about it, No, but I love him so much, Anyway, and that's when I said to myself, I'm out of here. And I'm waiting on mine to sign up for classes, and I asked the bursar, "So do my parents pay for this?" And the bursar says, "Yep." And I said, "Well, if I don't want to go, can you cut me the cash?" "Oh yeah, we'll pay you cash right here." So I signed this piece of paper. They gave me the $1,200 my parents had given Hofstra. And right at that time, a friend of mine who I went to high school with, who was a brilliant photographer, he had quit college too, and he basically had been a newspaper photographer for most of his life, and his boss died, and the newspaper offered him the job of photo editor, and he called me, "You want to be a photographer?" So I went down to High Point, North Carolina, right near Raleigh, Durham, and that was the furniture center of the universe. And I went down there, and that's when I realized that racism was the smokescreen of class, because this was a union town, and the South was not anywhere. It was like everyone was a slave, and so that town of High Point was very well to do, but everything around it was dirt poor. It was all tenement farmers, cotton and tobacco, and Duke and UNC were just kind of over there, and I had a lot of friends from prep school that had gone off to Duke and UNC. So, I was a photographer and hung out and really had, and other stories I'll tell about High Point, but had a very interesting 6 months doing that. And then, because I was trying to stay away from my draft board, I never broke the law. I just was never around whenever they came looking for me or sent me a piece of mail. Oh, he was just here, but he just left. And so I kind of went to Duke, and the best place to hide is in plain sight, where all these other students are. And I would go to colleges and find the most interesting professors and read their books and go to their lectures. And when they give an assignment, I would write a paper. And because I wasn't taking anything else, I could spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and then give them a paper that they would go, "Wow." And they, "Wait a minute, who are you? Your name's on my list. What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I've read all your books. I really snowed them up." And they would become my teachers. I mean, like Plato, Platonic scholarliness, not scholasticness. I did not matriculate. So when I was at Duke, this girl was she was into mapping the mind, right? And they didn't have any of the shit they have today. They had really caveman technology. But I had been fooling around with the esoteric technology guys, and I had built and had been playing around with sensory deprivation tanks. So, meet this girl. She's a psychology major, pre-med, she's endocrinologist. She was really pretty amazing girl. And, I was different than the average bear in that school, that's for sure. And she liked that because she really was not the preppy. She was really not the sorority girl. She was a scientist. And the fact that I was a scientist too, she kind of liked that. And that the fact that I wasn't arrogant, that I was like so impressed by her genius, her brilliance, and always was like deferring to her knowledge base, that she really liked that, and that we kind of sparked it up pretty good, that I had a little bit of experience more than she did, and she had a boyfriend or two that kind of was not very satisfying and kind of treated her bad, and me, I treated her like a queen and took care of every need she had, and she really kind of liked that. And most women do, and that's the amazing thing about most moron guys. If you have a woman in your life, guys, you should cherish that. But most moron guys don't have a clue about that. So anyway, she got me involved in her department. And her department was a special department because they were experimenting with paranormal psychology. And she told her professor, "Listen, I have my boyfriend here. He's part of the Theosophical Society." And he said, "Oh, really? Bring him over." So I went and talked to him, and we had a great little conversation. I told him all about, my scalar experiences and sensory deprivation and my meditation and all. And he said, "Wow, you're right. You're the guy we're looking for." So he got me onto his program as an adjunct, right? To build them these sensory deprivation tanks. And they were more than just a little bathtub with salt water. These were real sensory deprivation tanks, meaning I controlled the temperature, the airflow. I had anaconda, dampening, meaning these are like different shapes of foam, special foam, and you glue it to the ceiling, and it knocks out different frequencies of sound, so you can't hear anything, right? And so, and then I also put a Faraday cage around these things, so the people inside the tanks did not, there was no electromagnetic anything. I mean, they were totally cut off from all of their senses. They couldn't hear anything, smell anything, taste anything, see anything, feel anything, and this is what they wanted. And so, I got paid pretty good for, they gave me all these things. I made a little list of this is what I need. I built it, and they were like, whoa, this is pretty cool, kid. So I was on their team. So I was, exposed to what they were doing. And what these guys were doing, they were DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Program. And they were, this was being done by a corporation called the SEAL Corporation out of California. And this is what DARPA did. It, if, a government organization does some experiment, and I'm a researcher and I know what experiment it is and what it's called and what its reference number is, through a FOIA, I can find out about it. But if that research is being done by a private corporation, nobody can look at that stuff. It's proprietorial. So that's what DARPA does. Sets up these little corporations, and what the SEAL Corporation was all about, what they wanted to do, was to scientifically understand and map the mind so they could control the mind, not just in a, thing like MK Ultra, but so they could have super soldiers, guys who could go swimming in cold water that would cause most people to have hypothermia and it wouldn't bother them, that they could get shot and still run 20 miles. And so I was on the basement level of that kind of research in 1968 and 69 with this girl. And it got to a point, it was very interesting, it was very extraordinary, but it was very weird. And at a certain point, I said, it's time for me to move on, which I did. And I went back and was a newspaper photographer for a little while. And then I got involved with a woman named Norma, I was, maybe 19. She was 48. And she ran a motorcycle gang and was the largest purveyor of stuff in that neck of the woods. And because I lived in New York, she wanted me to take her to New York because she wanted to meet somebody there. And so she needed a guide. So I took her up there. And I called up my brother. I said, so is Mom and Dad home? And he said, oh, no. He said, where you been? I said, oh, I'm all over the place, but I'm okay. And he said, no, they're in Europe. And I said, oh, great. Because I had the key to their apartment. Park Avenue apartment, doorman, a concierge. They actually had elevator operators on elevators that were, where all you had to do was push the button, right? But all these guys were wearing monkey suits, and my parents had lived there a good 6 years by then. And so, I had known everybody who works there, since I was a teenager. Anyway, so I show up and we're on like Norma's bitch on the back of her Harley, and she's driving, and she drives, and this apartment is so fancy that the front door isn't on the curb. It actually has a road that goes under a, awning kind of thing, and, it has a setback, the whole thing. It's like quite fancy. And so and she like rolls not just up to the front door, but through the front door and leaves her Harley in the lobby. And it's a really nice, it's not a disgusting, it's like a beautiful bike. It's like a piece of art. And the guys don't complain at all. They just she goes, they like park it over there. She puts it over there. It looks like a piece of art, right? So we go up the elevator, and go into my parents' apartment, which is a very, actually, it's so fancy that it has 2 working fireplaces and a gigantic big veranda that looks out over Central Park. I mean, this was a pretty fancy place. Anyway, so, we're sleeping in my parents' gigantic king-size bed. That's really comfy. And, we're bouncing all over the place. And I take her out to, she's got a big bankroll, so I take her out to nice restaurants. She pays the bill. So I'm showing her the best of times, right? And she makes her little business connection, and everything's fine. And we're there for 4 or 5 days. And my brother had told me that they were going to be back by such and such, and we would be gone days before they showed up. So we're in my parents' bed. We're both naked. There's a big pile of money on one bedside table and a big pile of product on the other side. And she is riding me like a cowgirl, right? And I'm facing the door into my parents' bedroom, and I hear, Norma's like really, very motivated and focused on what she's doing, and I'm enjoying it, but I hear my parents open the freaking front door and walk down the hallway, and there's no way I can get up or do anything, and my parents walk in, and there is this 45-year-old lady, really good looking, really in great shape, riding their son like a cowgirl. And she's got a really great set of girls, and as she's going up and down, they're like going every which way, right? And my dad is kind of, uptight about sex. So he actually covered his eyes. And I'm looking at my mother watching me have sex. And she's not upset. She's not like aghast. She's got this like little smile on her face, and she's just shaking her head. But my dad is losing his everything. And I have to realize that about a year and a half before, I skipped out of college taking his $1,200, right? That I was supposed to be going to college on. Anyway, so he focuses on the pile of money on the bedside table, and he goes for that. And even though Norma is like having a great old time, she sees my father go for that and grabs his arm and stops him from grabbing her money. And they actually get into a wrestling match. My dad in his leisure suit and Norma totally naked, wrestling through his bedroom. And I kind of get up, and my mother just holds out a sheet to cover myself. And I do, and my father changes tacks and goes for the product. And Norma's like, focused on gathering her money and putting it into her motorcycle bag, and turns around and sees my dad do that. And she goes after him for that, and he drops that in the toilet, runs out, and grabs our clothes, opens a window, and throws our clothes out onto the street. And my mother hands Norma a sheet. And my father comes out, turns around from throwing our clothes out. Get out! And my mother says, you've just thrown their clothes out the window. How are they supposed to get out? Says, get out! My father just kind of, has switched into his Italian angry side, so there was no, logically talking to him. So Norma and I left. She grabs her motorcycle bag, and she and I walk out into the hallway with sheets around us, like togas, hit the elevator button. The guy comes up, And we walk in there, the three of us, we're both in sheets, and the guy is kind of looking sideways at Norma and a little bit embarrassed. And we get down, bing, and the doors open, and we walk through this pretty amazing lobby, all marble, big glass walls on either side, one looking out towards 69th and Park, and the other to this beautiful little garden they had in the back. Anyway, and there are people going to their apartments, and there we are, half naked, with sheets around us, and we go out and to where our clothes are on the street. We gather them up, and Norma, he just drops the sheet and puts her clothes on, and everyone's like, me, I'm a little more, deferential about it. Anyway, we get dressed. Before anyone could say anything, she starts the freaking Harley up in the lobby, loud. I don't know if you've ever heard of Harley. And I get on the back, she gets on, and off we go. So all of that represents that spirit, that time, and that movie, Across the Universe, has all these Beatles songs that were like the soundtrack of that time. And they really did, those guys, when they wrote that music, it like quintessentially dealt with that moment. I don't know, you two audience, if you're familiar with having the experience of hearing a song and it bringing back a memory of some summer or some event in your life. But the Beatles were the soundtrack of my life from 1964 until 1970. And so that's that story, and I hope you enjoyed it. And that's Woodstock, how it really is. Meaning it wasn't just a concert. It was a kind of living, a way of being, a story that was deeper than just that moment. Well, God knows how long this thing's going to take to load up. Tomorrow I'll try and do it, and we'll see how it goes. So thanks again, and I really want to thank you, YouTube audience, for all your support, all through everything, from the beginning on John's channel to the transition to this one. And I have to thank John, because I wouldn't be doing this without him. For all of the, it's kind of like, that girlfriend you have, that not your girlfriend, but a female friend you have, or a male friend you have, and then when they break up with that person, their girlfriend or boyfriend, all they can talk about for weeks on end is how that person jilted them, did this to them, did that to them, blah, 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 blah. And in reality, I'm not going to do that. I've done a little bit of it, but in all that I've said, I've tried to be fair towards John, because he really is a sweet guy. And again, he is the canary in the social coal mine. He really, and that's why he is my friend, and I do not, cut my friends loose. They can slip away, but I don't cut them loose. I don't throw them under the bus. I always think about them first. And that's kind of what I did with John. And at this time, I hope that John has learned from me enough by my example that he can make his life better. And that's what I hope for him, that he can make his life better. Because he has true potential, he has talent, he just has to stop worrying about things. Anxiety, like I said, there's no upside to it. You just have to move forward, move through it, get past it. I'm going to tell you a lot of stories. I've had a lot of sorrow in my life. I have a lot of loss in my life. I've had a lot of friends die, people I really cared about. I lost a lot of people I cared about. And until you have that experience, until when you talk about someone and you cared and loved about them so much, and when you talk about them, you start to tear up. Even after 30 years they're gone, it still makes you tear up, And that's when you stop thinking about yourself and you think about the other person. And that's where I hope John can go someday, where he can not always have to think about himself, that he can actually, because that's where the real joy in life is when you can love something other than yourself, and not feel obligated. You do things not because, not because you're obligated, because you want to, because you love that thing or person, right? You don't do it because you have to pay the bills or, no. It's because you love doing it. And that's the key to success. When you love something, you'll be successful. When you love someone, they won't have to love you back, but that's normally how it works. So, all I can say is I love you all, and you too, John Birmingham. I love you as a friend, and I only hope the best for you, buddy. So, catch you later.